Alcom's public message focus on shifting the responsibility to the consumer rather than addressing the industry role in producing the waste. They promote measures that focus on individual behavior rather than systemic measures. So, for instance, they promote measures like the pocket ashtrays that normalize tobacco use. But they avoid to support like effective measure like the filter ban or the creating of a tobacco-free zone. And we have an example. Recently, they did a survey with 400 mayors in France regarding the pollution of cigarette butts in some cities. And they communicate about the survey. And then only thing they said is that we have to do some prevention campaign toward the consumer. That's it. They did not promote anything else. Actually, so today Alcom have signed contracts with more than 1,200 authorities in France. It could look like much, but in France we have more like 30,000 cities, so it's not very, very much. But that create close and frequent interaction between the public institution and tobacco representatives. So it go against Article 5.3 of the FCTC. You can see one example at the bottom, like the pocket ashtray that they distribute at the tobacconist shop. In end of 2023, they launched a national media campaign, including street and digital ads. I'll show you some pictures. So they were like everywhere on the buses, on it was public display. And the main communication message was that they shift the responsibility to the consumer, saying cigarettes but pollutes more than you know, and that was only messages. So we did some advocacy work to go against this campaign, and we managed to have some red lines for the communication. So they have to add a quit line at the end of the communication for tobacco cessation and a health warning. But that's the only thing they do, and it's not on all the communication support, because as I said before, like the pocket ashtray, you can all see the logo, and yeah. And also, it's a very ineffective and sanctioned system because it has been officially censored twice by the French Ministry of Ecological Transition. Last year twice, and the fine was more than 1 million euros for them because they failed to reach their target. But despite this, it continues to benefit from institutional legitimacy. And yeah, that was it. Yeah. So to conclude, this system is really what not to do for EPR system. It's a perfect bad example because it enables tobacco industry to present itself as a responsible actor. It's like a form of greenwashing. It opens door for public and private partnership to serve the industry interest, and it fails to meet the international and national tobacco control policy that are very effective. And of course, at the beginning, the tobacco industry was strongly opposed to the polluter pay principle, and they took numerous legal action in France to avoid to pay. Like for the public ashtray that you can find in the city, they refused to pay for that, saying it's too expensive, and they took a lot of legal action. And more recently, it was British American Tobacco that took some legal action against the State Council in France, saying that they cannot reach the objective of 40% of reduction of cigarette ends because it was too high. But they lost, but they still gained some time, and it's like a strategy that's often used by the tobacco industry to gain some time and to yeah. So And like, as I said, it's strongly opposed to Article 5.3 and Article 13. So this is exactly what the FCTC aimed to prevent. So our recommendation, because in France, the situation is really well implemented, but it's not the case like everywhere. So it shows that the tobacco industry must not be involved in the design or operation of the system. It should only be limited to financial contribution in line with the polluter principle. It must have an independent governance, and public authorities should avoid relying on tobacco-linked organization. That is not the case in France, because it cannot be a communication tool for the tobacco industry. Yeah, that's it for me.
So that's exactly, as you said, an example of what not to do. And even the term eco-organism sounds very safe and gentle. But in this case, as it's truly dominated by an industry which is responsible for the problem and then uses it to circumvent and basically do exactly what the FCTC aims to prevent. So we will hear another example of what not to do, and that's from Spain. So I'll introduce the next speaker, Raquel Fernandez-Megina, who's the executive director of nofumadores.org in Spain. Raquel, please, the floor is yours. While Raquel gets ready, and by the way, it's still not on presentation mode. Raquel, we see the slides, but not in presentation mode. I again encourage everyone, if you have questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of the text, and you can start typing any questions you may have for the panelists. Raquel, go ahead. Raquel, you're muted. You're muted, Raquel. Still cannot hear you. No,
Yeah,
there you go.
sorry. Well, I'm going to walk you through the Spanish Royal Decree as an example of the way not to do extended producer responsibility for tobacco, which is actually following the lead of what France did. Okay. It was in April 22 that the Spain incorporated into its national legislation the subdirective, the European subdirective, and it had to enter into effect January 23. But it wasn't until October 24 that the Royal Decree approved for the Council of Ministers who regulates the management of waste from tobacco products enter into effect. So this regulation came was late, it was rushed, and obviously didn't really take much into account FCTC, even though it's in its prologue. We know that the Tobacco Control Organization did participated in the consultation process to be approved, and the Tobacco Control Organization, we did not take part because we didn't have really the capacity to stay informed on when the process was taking place. So I recommend you to stay alert of these things. We find several problematic issues in this Royal Decree. As it has been talked here before, the eco-organization responsible for the cleanup is established and formed by the tobacco industry. The decree allows the tobacco industry to manage the cleanup of tobacco waste and the decision-making process involved. And in fact, the tobacco industry, the very same date that the Royal Decree was approved, through a press release, present the new Tobacco Sector Association to Reduce the Environmental Impact of Filters. That's ABORA. That's an NGO which the tobacco industry has created to reduce the environment impact of filters. Okay. Another problem is that it facilitates the interact of the tobacco industry with public administration, as Amélie told us before, because it gives the extended producer responsibility system that we have seen is established by the tobacco industry might enter into agreements with municipal and regional representatives for both waste management and awareness campaigns. And of course, it's a clear violation of Article 5.3 of the FCTC. It promotes greenwashing by the tobacco industry and the advertising of its products, because the tobacco industry is entrusted with carrying out corporate social responsibility programs or awareness campaign, allowing it to enhance its reputation. And among these initiatives is the distribution of pocket ashtrays, an action that contributes obviously to the normalization of the tobacco consumption. Since the approval of the Royal Decree, we have observed a significant increase of the distribution of these disposable ashtrays, which has been published in the website of Abora and in the local press. And moreover, these initiatives are often carried with the collaboration of local municipalities, and the local authorities are frequently photographed during these actions, which also goes not only against the Article 5.3, but also against Article 13 of the FCTC. And also the transparency obligations of the tobacco industry are publishing in their websites different data of all this process, which gives the tobacco industry with a platform to promote its positive contribution to society, thereby, once again, allowing it to greenwash its image. We also see that it excludes eco-design and disposable e-cigarettes from the cleanup cost. Among the obligations of the filter producer is the requirement to develop and implement corporate prevention and eco-design plans with the aim of reducing the use of non-renewable resources. And also the creation of this eco-design filter is rewarded with a reduction in the industry's financial contribution to the cleanup efforts. And the regulation excludes the cleanup of future eco-friendly filters, even though these types of waste we have seen, even though despite the potentially being plastic-free, have a significant environmental impact due to their toxicity. And as it occurs in France, the cleanup costs of disposable electronic cigarettes are completely excluded of this Royal Decree, and the industry doesn't have to pay for them. Wait. Okay. The tobacco industry is responsible for its own evaluation, which is through a self-control mechanism, which is completely crazy because we know that self-control never really worked with tobacco industry, and or probably with any other industry. So, sorry, that's not working. My slides are not working.
Last slides on the conclusions doesn't work.
Oh, there. So, as my conclusion is that all these problematic issues with the Spanish Royal Decree are a consequence of treating the tobacco industry like any other producer of polluting consumer products. And not all producer and industries, as we have seen, are the same. Therefore, the same APR platform cannot be applied to all of them in the same way. The tobacco, we know, is not a consumer product comparable to any other on the market due to the health risks that it entails, and in addition to its serious environmental impact. So therefore, with regards to tobacco waste, the development of transposition of the sub-directive into national regulatory system must really be adopted, taking into account the specific characteristics of the tobacco industry to avoid any conflicts with the FCTC. And that's all.
Thank you, Raquel. So here another example of when not to do it. So Avoda is exactly the same equivalent to Alcom in France.
Yeah.
And one of the things we'll discuss later also, which was concerning, was then the response from the Ministry of Ecological Transition when it was pointed out that this was a conflict with 5.3. So we're going to go straight so we can, you can stop sharing so we can remove all the PowerPoints so we can just go
Let me
into
see if I can. I know how to do that.
the Ash team and Liz can help us with that. And we'll go
Yeah,
straight to the
please.
panel, and I will introduce also our fourth panelist who will join us for the panel section. So we have Deborah Sy, who's the head of global public policy and strategy at the Global Center for Global Governance in Tobacco Control, GGTC, and is an expert on the topic of 5.3 implementation, particularly, and the issue also of public health of tobacco product waste. So perfect. Thank you so much also for joining us today for the panel. And everyone, please, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. But my first question then goes to you, Debbie, because I am certain that those unfortunate examples we have from the European Union, which may have been well-intended at the beginning, but unfortunately have created a real problematic problem. Is this also something we see in other parts of the world and in other regions outside of the EU?
Thank you for that question, Laurent, and thank you for this opportunity to share. You're absolutely right. This is not an isolated issue in the EU. And doing tobacco EPR the wrong way appears to be contagious. And this, the tobacco industry for sure will be intending it to be so. They would want to infect every country with this sort of tobacco EPR. And so what the EU does to align its EPR with the FCTC is really crucial for the rest of the world. Now, I did a quick survey of policies across the world to check for EPR policy. So more than 70 countries have some form of EPR laws. So around 40 countries outside the EU have some form of an EPR scheme. Some of these are voluntary, but nearly all of them are built around plastics policies or general waste management policies. So among these, there's hardly any mention of tobacco or cigarette butts in their EPR law. So, you know, the whole industry, EPR would apply to the whole industry regardless of tobacco or otherwise. And in those few countries that do have or mention tobacco, there's really no sufficient detail on how this works. Now, we know EPR laws are being pushed by the business sector to skirt the plastic bans. And EPR is really framed as an ESG-friendly mechanism to attract investors and to gain a seat at the policy table. And all of this really steers the narrative away from the liability and polluters pay principle, and which may be acceptable for some industries, but definitely, as mentioned by the speakers, this really violates FCTC provisions. So in India, it's a textbook case, right, of violating Article 13. When the tobacco industry complied with laws requiring eco-friendly packaging, it was widely promoted as tobacco companies becoming responsible producers. And this really goes against denormalizing the tobacco industry CSR. And I think the worst case is that tobacco filters was totally excluded from that law. They're just really talking about tobacco packaging. And that's very common. So when the government have a discussion on EPR with the industry as a whole, including the tobacco industry, they hardly talk about filters. In Uruguay, there's a policy enabling biofilters, which was lobbied by tobacco company. And this is really an element of EPR at work, which is incentivizing innovations in product design. This not only helps promote the cigarette as being eco-friendly and attractive, it also positions the industry as a solutions provider. In the Philippines, the government included tobacco companies in the mandatory EPR scheme, at least the part of the law that's mandatory. But it hasn't yet figured out how to reconcile this with our policy on Article 5.3, our joint memorandum circular. One thing for sure, when the policy was adopted, the Ministry of Environment was not aware that filters cannot be recycled. And they didn't realize that allowing the industry to innovate, for instance, their product design, would essentially go against the Article 5.3 guidelines. In the 30 countries with EPR, in around 40 countries with EPR systems, I found that only a handful of documented application to tobacco. This includes Canada, US, UK, and South Korea. I want to mention South Korea. I had this distinct opportunity to discover its attempt to include tobacco in its EPR scheme while I was in Busan for the INC. So Korea included filters in their EPR scheme originally, collecting them separately and then recycling them. But the studies later found that the products made from recycled cigarette butts were actually carcinogenic. So South Korea stopped doing this, and instead they charge a fee for dealing with cigarette butts. So it's like a disposal fee, and that they charge in advance because later on they will have to deal with this tobacco product waste. And this is really fascinating to know, but it also demonstrates a serious knowledge gap amongst us on the implementation of Article 18. And this also tells us that clearly no international standards exist. We have really no safe way to globally agree to handle the cigarette butts or the toxic components of disposable vapes for that matter. And in most cases, these toxic waste is really treated as household waste or diverted into industry-run recycling programs. A practical interim solution, I think, would be to classify cigarette filters as hazardous materials or hazardous waste. And there's really also an international standard for classifying it as hazardous waste. Most of the low and middle income countries really understand polluter pays principle far better than EPR. And so that could also be an advantage for us. Many countries have some form of tobacco taxes, and some of these taxes have already been allocated to some sort of social or health program. Some of them actually environmental programs. And so that could be a cue that we need to make the tobacco polluters pay, and we do not allow them to be responsible producers. Another thing the world is very familiar with are environmental courts or tribunals, and over 60 countries already have this. So that's another step that we need to think about, aside from charging them with environmental levies, clean up taxes. We should be thinking about how we're going to file cases in environmental courts for the harms that are caused to the environment.
We'll get back. We will get back to that because I think you're answering already quite a lot of questions, and I want to actually unpack things a little bit, and I want to get back to the use of liability and legal options. So clearly, this is a problem that's happening way beyond the European region, as you said, in a number of cases. There's also the issue of the definition of the current definition of the extended producer responsibility, which, as initiated by the Lindqvist, one of the Swedish gentleman who first coined the term, had that concept of redesigning the product, which, as you mentioned, for tobacco, it's a major issue. But so you mentioned, and others have mentioned, then the concerns about having not just paying for the cost of the implementation, but also then the managing of the implementation. Danielle, you mentioned in the EU Waste Framework Directive that it states that corporations in general, and there's not just tobacco, but other corporations, opening the quote, they have to bear the financial responsibility or financial and organizational responsibility, end of quote. So in the two European examples that have been presented, for example, in the French context or the Belgian context, both of those have adopted to do both. But in the European context, that is not mandatory. Can you clarify that? Nothing suggests that they have to give the management to the tobacco industry. Can you clarify that?
Well, it's an option. So the Waste Framework Directive says really clearly that it's either financial or organizational and financial. if I was an industry and I was forced to pay for the collection, the transport, and the treatment of waste, I would like to have, I would prefer to have a say in it and not only pay for it. So it's exactly the opposite of what we say. We say, yeah, you have to pay and you don't decide. And they think, oh, the EU legislation gives me the opportunity to pay and decide. So that's the difficulty for the tobacco product waste, and this is the Waste Framework Directive. So actually, the Waste Framework Directive, there should be an exemption that these systems are not workable for the tobacco industry, and for the tobacco industry due to obligations, to international obligations. For this industry, there should only be a financial option and not the organizational financial one.
So it was interesting when then we heard, in the Spanish context, because there were concerns from the public health community, more than 60 international and Spanish organizations sent a letter to the Ministry of Ecological Transition stating the problem with and the concerns that this was a violation with Article 5.3. And so my question goes back to you, Debbie, and I will get back later to the liability. Sorry that I interrupted earlier on that, but I wanted to go over various questions. So in the context of the Spanish government, the response that they gave is that because the single-use plastic directive offers that option for producers in the context of the extended producer responsibility to give to the producer of the product the ability to have to pay for it, but also use the deal with the management of the product. So because of that, the response was that they were not violating Article 5.3. It seems to me that there is a contradiction because Spain in this context has an obligation to Article 5.3. Do you have an opinion as a lawyer who has particularly has an expertise in that area of 5.3 around the globe?
Right. I think for us, at least generally from the point of view of tobacco control advocates, I think the inconsistency is really, really clear. But I think from the point of view of like ministries of environment and people outside tobacco control, it's not that clear. I think they don't see what we see. And so maybe sometimes I think it's helpful to frame it more, not as, it's contradicting, but they might prefer to hear that, a solution. And I'm thinking one thing we could say is that, well, as far as Spain is concerned, this is still a binding international obligation, parties to the FCTC. And based on the Vienna Convention of the Law of Treaties, so they must interpret their treaty law, their domestic law as somehow harmonious to each other. So I think the Vienna Convention would say something like, in the context of and in the light of any relevant rules of international law applicable in the relations between the parties. So we could say, for instance, that the single-use plastic policy of Spain should somehow be interpreted in a manner that's harmonious to Article 5.3 of the FCTC. And that means when it's implementing that particular provision of the law, it should take into account that if they do it in that particular way, it could be contrary to, it could be undermining the Article 5.3 and Article 13 of promoting tobacco industry CSR. And therefore, there must be a way to make sure that when it's implemented, you apply a harmonious interpretation between that law and the FCTC and make sure that the tobacco producers only pay for the cost of the cleanup, but is not included in all these other decision-making roles, and that they shouldn't be allowed to brand or promote in a way that promotes CSR or would go against marketing or advertising bans of tobacco. So in essence, we don't have a choice really, but just really to remind Spain of its binding commitment, to the FCTC.
So in essence, yes, it does violate basically the FCTC, which is that was our understanding in that context. A question for Amélie. The France, I think you mentioned, is not most likely not going to achieve some of the objectives that were set up at the Ministry of Ecological Transition, like, for example, reducing 40% of the number of cigarettes that are discarded. And through that process also, then the Alcom was fined 1 million euros. And I don't quite understand how come it's still in charge of the process. Was it only because it did not achieve the targets of cleanup or reduction in cigarette butts being thrown or being on highways, for example? Or was it also because of the relationship with the industry? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, so it was not because of the relationship with the tobacco industry. It was just only because they didn't meet their requirements. So to reduce the cigarettes waste of 40%. And yeah, so what we do, like in France, so just to be clear, like I don't think we're gonna reduce by 40% by 2027. I think France is not on track to manage that for some reason, because tobacco industry is in charge. So they just promote measure, like, as I said before, based on individuals, a very awareness campaign, but no systemic efficient measure. So what we do in France to counterbalance the influence of Alcom, we engage directly with the municipalities that has contracted something with Alcom to raise awareness, to say, that it's the tobacco industry, because when they reach the municipalities, they don't always expose their ties with the tobacco industry. So we just say, okay, it's the tobacco industry that's behind, Philip Morris, BAT, etc. And if they already have a contract with them, we say, okay, take the money to do some put some public ashtray, and then at the end of the contract, don't renew them. And we also promote a lot of tobacco-free zone, especially locally, so in many cities. And we communicate also a lot about the role of the tobacco industry and the environment. So just to conclude, it's like local resistance and political awareness. But it's very difficult in France because the system is very well implemented. So you cannot do much, but it just try to counterbalance the influence of Alcom.
So it sounds, and so I'll go to some of the questions from the audience. It seems like one of the key solutions is really to address the products by basically phasing them out of the market. And so Marlis mentions, like in 26, the SUP is going to be evaluated. The Netherlands will push for a ban on cigarette filters and filters, which we very much support. Santa Cruz in the United States, in California, has done it, small jurisdiction, but that's a start. France has banned puff bars, use plastics. So the question maybe here for the four panelists, shouldn't that be the approach, to, given in the context also that cigarette filters do not do anything to protect health? They're very likely to be discarded. They're highly toxic, as has been mentioned. They're not recyclable. Shouldn't they be should that be one of the solutions, to just phase out those products out of the market and ban filters? What are your thoughts?
Well, I can start. I think that will be a great solution if we manage to the European Union and WHO and every country to ban cigarette filters. That will be a win-win situation for the health community and for the environmental community. But I don't know if we'll be able to. We really have to push for it. We really have to push for it. It's the way to go.
Yeah, Amélie, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I agree with Raquel. And just to add that we have to be careful because in France and I know in other countries, the tobacco industry already promote biodegradable filter. So we have to be very careful of that and to be aware that it's not a solution. So yeah, even if we manage to ban filter, they will find something
You
else.
mentioned
Yeah.
that earlier, the biodegradability. So I want to go back to questions to Debbie and bring back that issue of litigation or using the liability and back to the decisions coming out from the previous COP, Debbie. So here we're talking about responsibility, and we know, for example, corporate accountability has a campaign, an ongoing campaign to make big tobacco pay. And so how do you see the concept of liability in Article 19 and even using the recent COP10 decision on liability and environment that addresses and calls on holding the tobacco industry accountable for the environmental harms and also consequences for corporations for infiltrating policymaking. So what would you see as recommendations to enforce the implementation of the liability accountability provisions within the FCTC process to address this challenge? Would administrative litigation be a path for it? I think you were starting to go into that direction. So could you expand on that?
Right. So I think it's crucial to have our Article 19 on liability to be strengthened so that, we could do a lot more of these ways to make the tobacco industry pay for the harms. But one other thing we need to do is to make estimates. We need to find out how much we're going to make them pay, right? So I think having those numbers is really important. We do have right now, as far as tobacco plastic pollution, plastics alone from tobacco costs the government 26 billion annually. And this is really a very, very conservative estimate, but that estimate is already available. So if you think about it, we just really need to start charging the industry for some of these costs and then work further to estimate other costs. So that's really one way to do it. And then constantly figure out how we're going to make them pay for these things, because it really doesn't stop them if they don't have to pay for it. And I'm thinking that the other thing that's linked to this that needs to be done is really to build the capacity of the ministries of environment to understand these issues. They need to understand that intrinsically tobacco EPR is really contradictory. It's like saying tobacco CSR, right? And so it's very hard to get tobacco EPR right. And I saw a question around, is there such a thing as like a model tobacco EPR? We're working on something like that right now, but it's going to be really, really difficult. There are a lot of restrictions. So for instance, for it to be a model tobacco, ideally you want to ban tobacco EPR, right? So no EPR for tobacco. And then of course you'd want to also not just say that tobacco filters are plastics, you should say that they're hazardous waste.
Can I ask one quick clarification? You said no EPR for tobacco. So would you then articulate it as only responsibility, no extended producer responsibility for tobacco, only responsibility?
Definitely, because they should be polluters, not responsible producers, right? So but I think for those who are actually stuck, right? So stuck with tobacco EPR, yeah, there are some things they could do, right? So just make sure that the funds are governed in a way that it's spent through public agencies, so the tobacco industry doesn't control these PROs or eco partners, and there should be no incentives for product design innovations, and there should be some exceptions around industry communication. So that's one of the most crucial parts, is that the industry under EPR is allowed to communicate to the public about cleaning up, etc. That has to stop. Maybe one Laurent, one crucial issue I think is to use this opportunity to require information from the tobacco industry, because I think that now we're saying that, oh, if you're doing EPR, you get to communicate with the industry. Why aren't you asking them for the information that you really need, right? So we need to understand what sort of information we should require as well. Thank you.
A very good point. So I'm going to have a last question, Danielle. Danielle, you may want to add to that. So I have a last question for all of the panelists, and I'm going to give you, that will be because I'm conscious of time. So I will have in order of the same presentations, Danielle, Amélie, Raquel, and finishing with Deborah. And my question is the following, and you can also address any of concluding remarks, but my last question is, COP11, the 11th Conference of the Parties of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, is taking place this November. How do we maximize on this to advance on this topic? We know that environment will be front and center, and there's follow-up from the decision on environmental decision, Article 18 of the next COP. So how do we maximize on this opportunity to maybe highlight how it's poorly done in France and Spain and try to get the best possible outcome of the COP? So Danielle first, Amélie, Raquel, and we'll finish with Deborah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what is very important, because we have two things. We have COP11 and we have also the UN Plastics Treaty. And we should deal with them in parallel. And I think it's very important that we explain why EPR is not the system for the tobacco industry. So I think that's we have to show different cases. Of course, in the EU, we have 27 member states, so we will have 27 systems. So it's very complicated to see and to see what the evaluation will be out of that. And to promote so the filter ban, as some of the colleagues already said, which gives a lot of solution to different problems. So in the short time that we have, I think that would be the two paths to go, and there's still a lot of to discuss. So I hope that we will have the opportunity to do that further in the coming months.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Amélie.
Yeah, I think the main difficulty that we have is that we, for now, don't have a good system in place, like everywhere. So we only have bad examples, so we can use that to show what not to do, but what can we do? That's another question. And I think another difficulty is that, just like in example in France, it's quite difficult to reach out to the Ministry of Environment. We have the health ministry on our side that agree with us, especially for the filter ban. So that's a good thing, but it's more difficult for the environmental ministry. I think it's the same for other countries in Europe. So we have to focus our energy towards them and other ecological NGO, maybe to raise awareness and to show that health and environment should be treated together and not separately. So yeah, a lot to do.
Thank you for that. Raquel.
Yeah, it will be great if we can have more environmental organization in our side to fight for this. And obviously it's a good place to show the bad examples that Spain and France are have in place right now. And obviously it's a good moment also to push the ban on any kind of filters, of tobacco filters, and obviously disposable e-cigarettes, in explaining why EPR has to be used in a different way for tobacco industry. It's important. Obviously, there are two levels of compromise. The first will be using EPR and especially EPR for tobacco industry, meaning they only will have to pay for the cleaning, and obviously the best way and will be just to ban all kind of filters and disposable cigarettes.
Thank you so much. Deborah, so last words, and I have also you can conclude and give us our last recommendations on, as you give a tremendous amount of expertise in that area, last words on the topic for us.
Wow. There's a lot. I agree with everything that's been said. I think really important, like a session like this, putting together all those bad examples is really good. But I think when it comes to COP11, there is an opportunity to really systematize that, make sure that all these, good practices, bad practices, becomes part of the information exchange among parties. There's also clearly a huge gap in information for the Ministries of Environment. And what might work is there should be some sort of a source of technical information from an international body, an international standard, international guidance on handling these hazardous waste, including legacy waste, and then discussing how a ban on filters or disposable vapes might work, explaining, what it is that you can do when you're stuck with tobacco EPR, what are those guidelines and safeguards that you need to put. I think that sort of an expertise is badly needed. And I think at the COP, we really need to think about what are the strategies to make sure that we build cross-sector capacity, to make sure that our ministries of health are able to engage with the ministries of environment. Because I think that's also crucial, because nobody's communicating the issues that we already know to the Ministry of Environment. Hardly any of them actually know that there's no such thing as circularity when it comes to tobacco, because these filters are too toxic to recycle. And that the tobacco industry is really very unique, and there are really rules on why we shouldn't be engaging with the tobacco industry. So a lot of this needs to be communicated to the right, to the Ministries of Environment, and we really need that pathway established at the COP11. I think that's just about it. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to really thank all of the panelists. This was really, really interesting. I think we could have gone for another hour because there's questions from the audience. Lots of questions also that we had received from people who have registered, but who told me that they were not able to join the event. So clearly there's a lot of interest on this topic. There's a lot of issues. How would we also link the FCTC to other, and you touched a little bit on this, Deborah, link it to other treaties that deal with hazardous chemicals, for example, and so on and so forth. So a lot more work to be done. ASH has a webinar on April 24th on the Santa Cruz example in California, which has managed to ban filter bans. And that will be on the 24th of April. So I encourage you to join if you have the opportunity. It's 3 p.m. Eastern time in the United States. That's for those who are in Eastern Europe, that would be Western Europe, 9 p.m. But check with your time zone. Also, I encourage all of you to join our ASH Tobacco Endgame Policy and Advocacy training course. And again, thank you all of you for joining us today. And I really want to thank the panelists again. That was a wonderful session. And thank you all very much for your work. Bye.
Thank you.